Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Frederick the Great, and Geoffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Thank you for joining me again on the History of the Papacy. We are almost done with the series on the papacy of Pope Pius IX and the development of the ultramontane position in the Catholic Church, really the end of an era. There's one more episode to come, which will be a capstone or an epilogue to everything that we've talked about. We've got some really big things to come. For one thing, 2023 is the 10th anniversary of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I have a big 10th anniversary special. It started off as doing a one-off 10th anniversary episode, but it just kept growing and growing. But I think you will really enjoy it. There's other big news too as well. Some other exciting news. I just finished my first year teaching at a new school. And I'm prepping for the launch of my new podcast, which you will hear a little sampling of very soon. So I'm excited for all of that, excited for summer vacation especially. Now I need just a little bit of time to prepare for the last episode. So instead of skipping a week, I'm presenting a little bit of bonus content that was originally only for patrons who support the History of the Papacy on Patreon. These aren't completely random, though. They're related. Both of these segments are related in a way to the series we've been covering. The first episode is the end of British Christianity, and it's related closely to the John Newman episode that we did. And I really wanted to explore in a short format, what is the Church of England and why is the church in England and in Britain so different than, at the very least, Western Christianity, but really Christianity in general? So I wanted to present this episode to really show or maybe think about just one piece of the puzzle of why British and English Christianity is so unique. I plan to explore this issue and the whole Church of England and the British Church much more, probably in the bonus content format. Then the second part is a little bit more tangentially related, but it's definitely related to the English church and the British church. And that is called Bee Beginnings. Last year, I accidentally became a semi-professional beekeeper and the owner of an apiary. That's a long story. Of course, as I usually do, no matter what, if I start a plumbing project or I have to redo the roof, before I start doing anything, I start searching the history of that topic. And I got drawn into the history of beekeeping. It ties in so much to the history of the Christian church, because the church, especially in the West, but really in monasteries all throughout Christendom and Europe, were really the driving forces of making candle wax, which was the light source for Europe, essentially all throughout the Dark Ages. And I'm talking Dark Ages up until the advent of electricity, basically. I mean, of course, lighting, there'll be other methods that'll come along, like whale blubber oil, etc. And really, candle wax is one of the best lighting sources available in a pre-electricity era. So I think, and generally, the history of beekeeping is really amazing. In future episodes, I really want to explore this more, and I have a bunch of resources on this. In this very first episode, I'll really be exploring what are honeybees, how do they operate scientifically, and just a high level over understanding what honeybees are so that we can dig more into the history. Again, this will probably be a bonus series on the history of the papacy's Patreon account. It's really also this very first episode, and both of these are proofs of concept. I definitely want to do much more on each of these topics. So definitely reach out to me if you want me to focus on one of these topics or some other topic entirely. And I'd love to hear that. If you want to hear these episodes first, because I have a lot of bonus content that's still only Patreon only. So if you want to get these episodes right away, as soon as they're published, go over to patreon.com/history of the papacy to sign up. And there's a whole bunch of tiers. There's benefits at every tier. There's monthly book drawings. I do a little bit of a monthly newsletter on there. There's at different levels, you can earn t-shirts and apparel and all sorts of fun things. If you ever have questions or comments, you can always reach out to me on social media, which you can find all of that: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, by searching for A to Z History Page. We're also on YouTube, and we're going to have a lot more videos up there. But the biggest thing that you can do to support the show is just go out there, tell a friend, tell a couple of friends. If they're into history, into church history, tell them about the history of the papacy, and tell them about the History of the Papacy podcast, and encourage them to listen and like and subscribe. Here we go with this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian church. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. Today we have a short piece of Roman Celtic Christianity in what would become England in 10 minutes or less. Now, where this episode came from was basically I've been researching, ironically enough, the 19th century papacy, but what was going on in England really impacted those times. As I got digging, I just learned more and more about how the church in England was so unique in what's going on in Christianity all throughout history. And so I wanted to start looking at chunks of why that history was so unique. And we're going to start off in Roman times because that's when Christianity started there. We did an entire series with Dr. Carly McNamara on the history of Celtic Christianity for more detail. What we really didn't talk about, though, was the Romano-British Church in what would become England. The focus was more on Ireland and then Scotland in the 400s going forward. But let's talk about actual Britain in the 300s and a bit earlier. I mean, really, Christianity would have spread into Britain the same way it did everywhere else. First, it would have gone into the major cities among the so-called middle classes, the merchants and the traders. There would have been some spread into the upper classes and then some spread into the slaves and the lower classes as well. Britain was really it really was, and at least at that time, the furthest point out there in the Roman Empire. So Christianity had less of an impact there than it did in other areas. If we just look back for a second, Christianity's nucleus is in and around the Holy Land and Jerusalem, and it just keeps spreading out in waves from there. And it's really the closer you are to that Heimat of the Middle East, the more Christians there were, and there was less and less as you spread out outside of the Jewish diaspora and into more Greco-Roman pagan areas. We really don't hear much about the church in Romano Britain. And that's why we're talking about it today. The entire history of the Church of England and Great Britain is strange, and that strangeness will carry us all the way through to the 1800s. As I was saying, the Roman British Church was really light on the ground, but it existed. There were bishoprics in all the major Roman cities of London, York, Colchester. They had different names, but those are the modern iterations. So there was a small but not insignificant number of Christians. Scholars can deduce, or at least make some wild assumptions, that there were some number of Christians in the smaller towns and villages as well. There is some archaeological evidence of church building in some of the smaller to medium-sized Roman cities. The 300s was a relative growth period for both Christianity and the general society of Gaul and Britain. The Romano-British Church was Orthodox, meaning no heresies of any point. It didn't really subscribe to Marcionism or anything like that. It was pretty much straight down the line Orthodox Catholic Christianity. Proto-Orthodoxy, you might call it. The church there was a bit small, and it appears to be a bit disorganized as well. Again, archaeological evidence that Christian ideas were being overlaid and syncretized with British religious practices. Not necessarily in a bad way, in ways that's just these things normally went down at that time period, but maybe a little bit more in Romano Britain. Then we get into Pelagius, who was the inventor of Pelagianism. Now, we've talked about Pelagianism a lot in past episodes. The West and the Western Church considered him a heretic. He was arch enemies with Augustine of Hippo. The East was a bit more understanding of him, and at least personally, and he didn't get condemned in the East the way he was out and out condemned in the West, but he made his name, his initial name at least, in Romano Britain. So that's the real short story of the Roman Church and the church in general in Britain up until the 300s. And now we start to roll into the 400s and things get a bit more interesting and they begin to change. The Western Roman Empire was on a slight uptick during the 300s. The building up of the church, the economy of the society in the West was going up, but it was all built on weak foundations. Roman Britain and Gaul are similar in many ways, and both suffered massive invasions. Britain maybe more so because it was on the periphery. Britain was invaded by Picts from the north side of Hadrian's Wall and Saxon tribes from the continent. In 410, the Roman central government told Britain that they were on their own. They had to take care of themselves because all the legions were being pulled from Britain to go fight on the continent. So I won't get into all the details, but I'm sure you're at least aware of the broad strokes of what happened at this time. And my guess is you know more than the broad strokes if you're listening to this type of podcast. Now, the Romano-British nobleman named Vortigern took over the situation there. And there's so much to say about this guy Vortigern and Arthurian legends. That's a different story for a different day. But the short story is the Picts were really picking apart the Roman British. The Romano-British did the best they could, and really the best they could do was hire Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Uitlanders, which were Danes of some sort, Frisian mercenaries from the continent for protection against the Picts. These Germanic Saxon tribes were not Christian of any sort, unlike other Germanic tribes at this time. They were completely pagan, and these tribes saw an opportunity. Why work for the weakened Romano-British regime when the Germanic-Saxon coalition could just take them over? So many different theories on this invasion and takeover exist, but that's the thing in the broadest strokes. The Germans were brought in to protect the Romano-British, and they were paid to do so. But as sometimes happens with mercenaries, when they see a place ripe for the pickings, they're the muscle, you just take over. And we can see, we meaning the scholars, see a really clear evidence of what happened to Christianity in Romano Britain. The whole institution of the Roman Catholic, Western, Latin church just gets completely wiped off the map. The Romano-British were subjugated, and the standard story is that they were wiped out, the complete genocide. That's probably not the complete case, but there was something to that. The Celts, these Romano-British Celts, were pushed aside or brought into the household as slaves or subservient people. So basically their culture, religion, language completely pushed to the margins, even if they are inside of the Germanic society. Linguists like John McWhorter say that the Celtic language made a huge but not easily seen mark on the Anglo-Saxon language. Again, that's a different story for a different day, but fascinating. The church as an organization was completely wiped out. Christianity survived and thrived in Ireland, as we saw in our Celt series with Dr. McNamara. But in Britain, it's stayed way under the surface, but so did more traditional religious elements because Christianity just was never that embedded and established in Romano-British culture. And again, the overlord Germanic barbarians were pagans, so they were suppressing things as well. There's some unique characteristics of the fall of Roman Britain compared to Roman Gaul. Christianity just didn't get that strong foothold in Britain. In Gaul, Christianity seeped much more so into the fabric of society, and it went more widely and more deeply. There was more buildings of churches, more bishoprics into more areas and more rural areas. There were great leaders like John Cassian, Martin of Tours, and many other big names, you might say, who spread Christianity. The Germanic groups that flooded into Gaul were really a barbarian of a different flavor as well. The Germanic tribes that conquered Gaul were predominantly Christian, especially if we think the Franks. Some were Arian, some were semi-Arian, and sure, they disagreed with the Orthodox Christians they conquered. But hey, I mean, at the end of the day, they were all Christians. There were some persecutions in some cases, but really not many at all. And the Franks were actually Orthodox Christians. After a time, the Franks became the new bosses, and they really upset the apple cart in their own way, but not as far as religion went. So this leaves us with the situation where institutional Roman, Catholic, Orthodox Christianity became completely extinct in what would be called Anglo-Saxon lands, or eventually England. Let's just briefly move into the next phase in Christianity in England, and then build on why Christianity was so distinct in England and how it would eventually lead us to the Oxford movement in the distant future. We'll get into this more in future episodes. So by the early 400s AD, the pagan Anglo-Saxons were in the process of conquering the island of Britain. The established church was pretty much done in Britain. The pagan Anglo-Saxons pushed the Celts to the margins, and the Celts probably stayed Christian in some way. They continued their native Celtic religion and even adopted and adapted some forms of Anglo-Saxon German paganism, all synchronized into one new flavor to the Christianity in England. They also were getting constant contact from the Celts in Ireland, and there was a growing Christian community in pagan Anglo-Saxon England. This will eventually lead us to our episode on the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons and the other Germanic peoples of England, but that's going to have to wait until next time. I hope you enjoyed another bit of Papal and Church history in 10 minutes. Thank you to all our patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy. And the best thing you can do to help support the show is tell a friend about the show and get them to like these episodes and subscribe. And I will talk to you soon. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. There is enough going on with bees and beekeeping in medieval Ireland for special laws to be fashioned to regulate the issue. Let's see what all the buzz was about in 10 minutes or less, or at least we'll try definitely no more than 15 minutes. We'll probably have some episodes on bees and beekeeping in antiquity in the Middle Ages coming up in bonus episodes. There are a few reasons for this. One, I'm really interested in beekeeping, but there's more. There are at least a few other reasons, though. Bees were a big business in the past. They still are today, but in pre-electricity, pre-fossil fuel times, bees were key in two really important areas, sweets and light. Most of our sugar cravings today are satisfied by refined sugar or corn syrup. For people before the modern age, those just weren't options. Now lighting or illumination is the other story. This was, as William Manchester wrote in a whole book, a world lit only by fire. No crisp, clean, bright fluorescent lights here, or LED lights. So what did the people in the past do to get their sugar fix and not trip over themselves when they went to go to the bathroom after the sun went down? One little creature provided for both of those needs, the honeybee. The thick, liquid honey brightened up people's nights as much or more than the great illumination from the beeswax candles they used. In this series of bonus episodes, we are going to do something that I've not seen done in the podcast format. We are going to explore the history of bees and how humans harness the work of the bee to our own wants and needs. We will then delve into how the church and other actors were involved in this big bee game. In today's episode, we'll lay down some of the bee facts and maybe even debunk a few bee myths along the way, because there are plenty of bee myths out there. The place to start is, what are bees and how do they work? There are close to 4,000 species of bees. There are huge bees and tiny bees and everything in between. The Apis mellifera, or honeybee species, are bees we are most concerned about in this series. There are bumblebees and other bees you might see out in the garden. They are important pollinators. They make wax and honey, but the other non-honeybee species either don't make much honey, live a different lifestyle, or otherwise aren't as productive for human use. So what is special about honeybees that make them so useful and form a sort of synergy with humans? Scientists consider the honeybee a domesticated animal, although feral or bees living out in the wild essentially do the same thing as honeybees living domestically. I can say I never knew much about how bees really operated. I thought the big bumblebees were the bees that made honey, and that bumblebees and honeybees were synonymous. I was incredibly wrong about that. Bumblebees do make honey, but they don't make very much. Honeybees' survival strategy is to produce and store a really large amount of calories for hard times during the year. Let's take a quick look at how bees work, so to speak, and that will help us understand more about how humans have harnessed the amazing power of bees throughout history. Now, from this point forward, when I refer to bees, I will specifically mean honeybees. It's just easier to call them bees. Bees are what we call a so-called eusocial insect. That means they have a highly organized social structure inside of their colony. Inside the colony, there are different classes, you might say, of bees. There are males and female bees, but in a colony, most bees are female. The classes of bees are the queen, workers, and drones. The queen is a female that is about 1/3-ish larger than a female worker. We'll get into the queen more in a moment, though. About 15% of a healthy hive is so-called drones. Drones are male bees, and they're a bit larger than the female workers, but a bit smaller than the queen. Drones have one job and one job only. They impregnate the queen. Other than that, they just hang around the hive waiting to impregnate the next queen. The queen lays eggs. Bees make almost perfect hexagonal shaped cells. They store resources in those cells, and the queen lays eggs in the cells, which will metamorphose into adult bees. A queen bee can live up to 5 years. A newly developed queen will have to fight to the death with the reigning queen, or she can fly off with about half of the hive to find her own place to live. Initially, though, she has to fly out of the hive into what is called a drone swarm, or a group of males. She mates with the drones and then flies back to the hive. That will be the only time she mates during her whole entire life. Mating flights are also the only job that drones do. Queens lay eggs, drones mate with the queens. Now, female workers are a completely different story. They do a multitude of jobs. The female worker bee during the spring and summer has a lifespan of about 40 days max. A worker born in the winter can live up to about 200 days, but that's a time of much less activity in the hive. The spring and the summer are the bees' busy season, you could say, and they make hay while the sun shines. Worker bees start off their life moving dead bees out of the hive. Talk about starting off with a terrible job at the lowest rung of the career ladder. I'll skim over the detailed job description, but workers will move on to a succession of jobs, including attending to the drones, then attending to the queen, then attending to babies. They will become part of the air conditioning of the hive by either beating their wings or spitting water into the draft created by the workers beating their wings. They'll be guards, and finally, they will go out to gather water, pollen, and propolis and nectar. By that point, the workers are fairly much worked to death and then die. So where does honey come into this complicated web of a bug's life? Honey and pollen is what the bees need to live. Honey provides the carbohydrates and pollen the protein. Queens, drones, and workers are differentiated by how much protein they are fed while they are gestating, if you will, in the brood cell. Queen larvae are fed an extremely protein-rich mix called royal jelly. Worker bees spread out as far as 7-ish kilometers, 5 miles in search of resources. Many types of flowers and trees produce sweet nectar to draw in animals. It's an evolutionary strategy to get these animals like honeybees to get coated in the plant's pollen, and it's not just squirrels do it, I mean, you name it. Then the animal can move on to another plant of the same type and allow the plants to produce more plants. The animals also get a food source in return for their efforts. Bees suck up a tiny bit of that nectar with their proboscis or straw-like mouth part. They also gather up some of that pollen on their hairs that cover their body. If you look really closely at a bee, you can see they neatly clean themselves and put that pollen into packages on each of their legs into what is called their pollen saddlebags or pollen baskets. The forager bees bring their nectar and pollen back to the hive and hand them off to other workers at the entrance. After the handoff, they buzz off to collect more resources. After the handoff, the real work begins. Some bees take the pollen, they digest it in special organs and then spit it into cells. This stored pollen is called bee bread. Nectar has a bit of sugar in it, but the sugar is not very concentrated. One thing the bees do to concentrate the nectar is to transfer it back and forth between themselves. The nectar is digested during this back and forth process. Eventually, the digested and concentrated liquid is moved to individual cells. The bees then beat their little wings to dry the liquid out even further to about 80% sugar content. The bees will then use that honey to feed larvae and everyone else. So this is the really basics of how bees work in either a cave, the hollowed out part of a trunk of a tree, or in a man-made hive. I hope this wasn't too much information, but I thought it might be interesting to some, and I also think the basic mechanics are a good place to start as we look at how humans used and modified how bees work for our own purposes. This background will also help us understand how the church harnessed big honey in the Middle Ages and beyond. Now, that's it for this piece of Papal and Church History in 10 minutes. Thank you to all the patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy. You are the people that make these episodes happen. And if you ever have an idea for the history of the papacy in 10 minutes, let me know and we'll make it happen. And I will talk to you soon.